Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today we are on the second last book of the entire Valdemar series, the second book out of the Darian's Tale or Owl trilogy. I tend to call it the Owl trilogy because all three book titles start with Owl because, that's what they start with. Anyway, I've owned this book for years now, and this is the first time, just yesterday was the first time that I had read the blurb, "Can a small band of Hawk brothers and two teenagers with untrained gifts defend their community against a hostile barbarian horde?" And for the first time I read that and thought, that is wholly inaccurate as to what's going on in the book. Because, first of all, they say a small band of Hawk brothers, and sure, there's a small band of Hawk brothers. There is also the local lord/duke type character, Lord Brian, who has a whole bunch of armsmen. And by the end of the book, Carowyn and a bunch of her skybolts and various other people who had trained with her skybolt for approximately 1,000 people, give or take, showed up as well. So it's a small band of Hawk brothers and a local lord's armsman and 1,000 trained fighters. So it's really understating the force that gets brought to bear against this so-called horde. Second, the two teenagers, Darian Firkin from the last book, and Keisha Alder, who shows up for the first time in this book. Indeed, about half of the book, or slightly more than half of the book, is actually about Keisha from Keisha's perspective. And Keisha is a young woman, maybe 18 years old, who has a healer's gift, and who has been training as a healer, and who, certainly by the time this barbarian horde shows up, has not only received training in her gift, but has basically reached the point where everybody has been telling her all you have to do now is practice to effectively build up your metaphorical magical muscles. That it's a matter of just practicing techniques at this point to build up strength. So half-trained really seems like an inaccurate description, and Darian is half-trained only in that he's now at a point where he requires specialist training in the details of his mage gift, and at that point it's not really half-trained. It's kind of like, somebody has a bachelor's degree. Just because a person doesn't have a master's degree or a PhD doesn't mean that this person has no degree. And so half-trained also really feels like a misstatement of where Darian is in terms of his skills and abilities. And then defend their community against a hostile barbarian horde, except the barbarian horde is not hostile. They are, in fact, a crowd of, in practical terms, refugees. Yes, of course, they have warrior types with them, they have fighters with them, but that's because the entire community as a whole is moving, and they are, in fact, not hostile, basically until the Valdemarans show up and the Northerners get their backs, wind up with raised hackles in response to the Valdemarans sort of doing a big show of magical and military power against them. So, they don't get remotely really aggressive until that point, and the other point when they risk coming to blows is when the leader of them becomes convinced that the Valdemarans have kidnapped his 2 children, which is not really the most irrational thing I've ever heard. If you believe somebody has kidnapped your children, you kind of do have a right to be, unhappy about that. Shocking, isn't it? So, it's really very, very different. Now, the last book basically introduces the characters, basically introduces Darian and his situation and why he's in the straits that he's in, and then, basically flings the barbarian invasion into Errold's Grove, and boom, right there it is. The bulk of this book is actually taken up with Keisha settling herself into her place as as the Errold's Grove healer. And one of the interesting things, of course, that has to do with the so-called half-trained bit is that Keisha is basically that the nearest healer to her doesn't really have a healer's gift, that he's somebody who is a healer more in the way that we would consider to be a doctor. That is, he uses, various treatments of herbs and whatnot that have been proven to have treatment capacities, and if somebody, has a large cut on their arm, he can stitch it together and set bones and things that we would imagine doctors doing. But he doesn't have the magical woo-woo ability to, put his hands on somebody and cause things to be just fixed by the force of his will. And because of that, he didn't really receive any training in that. And Keisha, who was sent a bunch of books to help train her healing, is left with these books that are trying to explain things, but it's kind of like these books that nobody gave her the basic lesson in understanding those books. So it's kind of like, if you get the grade 11 biology textbook, but you never took grade 10 biology. You'll look at it and you'll say, but I don't know what that is, and you flip through the book and nothing explains this basic concept. Or perhaps more like if you were introduced to long division, but nobody had ever bothered explaining multiplication to you. And so what you've got, aside from the fact that my timer just beeped at me, so what you've got is you've got this young woman who's trying to basically train herself, while at the same time she doesn't have any real ability to totally understand what they're talking about. As she says in the book, they have all this stuff about grounding and centering, but she doesn't know what grounding and centering is. Now, in the meantime, we come back to Darian, who, after several years on the road with a small group of Teledras who are sort of helping parts of Valdemar get settled in the wake of the mage storms, dealing with change creatures and trying to reorganize and reset all of this magic that's sort of been flung into the air higgledy-piggledy, and to try to settle it so that it will resettle more quickly and in ways that will be advantageous for all concerned. He gets to finally go to the proper Teledras Vale to meet this clan that he's been adopted into, but by about halfway through the book, the plan that he had suggested at the end of the last book of setting up a sort of an outsider's area that could be used, that he could come back and be sort of a go-between meeting point between Valdemar and the Hawk brothers, that thing, it turns out, winds up being set up. And so Darian and several other people who we were introduced to in the last book, including Kel the Griffin, and of course Darian's owl, because he has an owl, and I assume that's his owl, Kuari. Although we all know that the bestest owl ever is Hedwig. Because, Hedwig is the best owl ever. Anyways, so Keisha winds up meeting Darian when there's a big village party, inviting him back and, welcoming him back and stuff like that. And the two of them become friends, but with his arrival, he's brought along, among other things, his adoptive older brother, Snowfire's wife, Nightwind, and Nightwind has healer abilities and is finally able to give Keisha an explanation about all of these basics of dealing with her gift that Keisha never understood. And you have this lovely little bit when Keisha's able to go back to all of her books about the gift and says, oh my god, this all makes sense now. Which I think that this is very much a fundamental failing on the part of Valdemar, because they really should have arranged for a gifted teacher to come out and help her. But, it's that kind of oversight of, well, there's already a healer out there, so obviously he'll be able to help her. Well, Healer Gil wasn't, because he's not really particularly gifted, but what can you do? So here's a picture of Darian with Kuari, because, a boy and his owl is always an excellent, excellent thing. And just because I kind of like this picture of King Stag Tercel, the Dihali were introduced in the Mage Winds trilogy, but this is the first time I think that we really see an illustration of one, and so it is with this that we now know that Dihali are not in fact talking deer, they are talking antelopes. So there you go. It's a picture of a telepathic antelope. So this is a book in which we do eventually have the barbarians come back, the so-called barbarians, these northern peoples who are sort of a little bit Viking and a little bit Celtic and a little bit Northern and First Nations / Native American. Like, we're talking, people in the zone of like the Cree and the Huron and the Tlingit peoples on the West Coast, for example, as opposed to people in the more southern end of North America, which are, like the Navajo. And the thing is that we're not talking Navajo, we're talking Huron, Cree, etc. So they're kind of a little bit of that and a little bit Viking, is 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The first invasion was a bunch of warlike semi-morons. This is a group of people who are effectively refugees looking for, a new place to live and treatment for a very serious illness. And the last book sort of does wrap up Darian's tale, not only in its way resolving finally the whole northern tribal thing, but also the next book resolves the fate of Darian's parents, who don't really get discussed in this one because, well, we're more focusing on this new settlement. Anyways, that's all I'm going to have to say about this book, so I will see you all next week.